It all started with $5. Just $5, tossed casually across a table, a gesture that seemed almost meaningless in its smallness. But in that moment, that $5 bill carried with it more than just currency. It carried curiosity, challenge, and a spark of mischief that neither party fully understood at the time. The people holding the bill didn't think of it as a bribe, a wager, or even an invitation for trouble. They thought of it as a joke. A little game to see what someone would do for such a paltry sum. $5 isn't much to most people. It barely buys a cup of coffee, a snack, or a cheap trinket. But the psychology of small bets is powerful. There's something about offering someone a seemingly insignificant reward that suddenly transforms ordinary decisions into tests of character. It is the lure of the negligible that masks the potential consequences, the quiet trap hiding in plain sight. The person who received the $5 didn't blink at the offer. At first glance, she might have seemed like someone who would go along with anything, someone pliable, someone who could be swayed by a small incentive. That assumption, innocent or mischievous as it may have been, was precisely what made the scenario so dangerous. People often underestimate the weight of their decisions when the stakes appear low. They forget that even trivial gestures can ripple outward in unpredictable ways, that even the smallest action can ignite a chain reaction far beyond anyone's expectation. The $5 offer was nothing to them. To her, it was a question, an opportunity, and a test all rolled into one. It's fascinating how money, even in its most minimal form, can act as a symbol of influence and risk. A single bill can represent control, persuasion, and the illusion of power over someone else. Those $5 were offered with a smirk, a laugh, and perhaps a sense of superiority. They imagined that the act they were proposing was simple, harmless, and amusing, a tiny ripple in an otherwise ordinary day. What they failed to grasp was that they were engaging with someone who had layers they couldn't see, someone whose experiences and capabilities extended far beyond what a casual observer might perceive. In psychology, there's a principle called the foot-in-the-door phenomenon. Small requests can lead to larger actions, often escalating in ways the requester cannot predict. But what happens when the recipient has the power to flip the script entirely? That's where the $5 became far more than its face value. It became a pivot point, a moment charged with tension and potential. Every interaction carries subtle cues, and this one was no different. She could see the laughter, the casual confidence, the assumption that she would comply because the cost of refusal seemed trivial. But compliance, even in small matters, is never guaranteed. Even when the reward is tiny, the person being asked to act holds the agency. They can choose, subvert, or escalate. The $5, intended as a lighthearted nudge, was a mistake because it underestimated the complexity of human decision-making. Money does not buy submission, at least not always, and certainly not in cases where experience, skill, or resolve outweighs the lure of trivial gain. That $5 bill, so innocuous to those who offered it, carried a hidden risk that they never calculated. It's easy to look back at small gestures and see them as inconsequential, but in reality, every action is a potential turning point. That $5 offer seemed like nothing, a laugh, a joke, but it planted a seed that would grow, quietly at first, into an entire unfolding of events they never expected. People are constantly making judgments based on appearances and assumptions, often ignoring the depth and capability of others. That small slip, that casual offering of cash, was loaded with underestimated consequences. In retrospect, it becomes clear how tiny acts can be catalysts for enormous outcomes, how a single bill can become the starting point for a story that spins wildly beyond anyone's control. Even the physicality of the act mattered. The way the bill changed hands, the casual toss or placement, the subtle gestures that signaled intent, all contributed to the tension that none of the participants fully recognized. $5 might as well have been a spark in a powder keg. It was small enough to be dismissed, but potent enough to ignite far more than anyone imagined. Every detail, from the smirk that accompanied the offer to the slight hesitation of the hand reaching for it, carried meaning. Those microactions, often overlooked, set the stage for everything that followed. Underestimating the wrong person is a mistake that seems almost universal. People do it all the time, often without even realizing it. We tend to rely on appearances, superficial cues, and quick assumptions when forming judgments about others. In this situation, the mistake was glaring, almost comical in hindsight, yet at the moment it felt justified. They saw her and thought they knew exactly what she would do. The confidence in their assumptions gave them a false sense of control, a belief that their plan was harmless, straightforward, and foolproof. It's an error rooted in ego, in the human tendency to believe that the familiar rules of interaction will always apply, that others will behave in predictable ways, and that small gestures or bets will never escalate into something larger than expected. They judged her by the smallest, most visible traits: her size, her tone, the casual way she responded. She didn't seem threatening. She didn't seem like someone who could push back. But this is where underestimation thrives, where the unseen, the untested, and the unspoken abilities of a person are ignored because they don't match the expectations of the observer. Underestimating someone is less about their actual abilities and more about the limitations you impose on your own perception. It's the gap between reality and assumption, and in this scenario, that gap was massive. Experience is a deceptive thing when overlooked. Someone who has faced challenges, who has been trained or tested in ways that others cannot even imagine, carries a depth that is invisible until provoked. The people who offered the $5 never considered that she might have a background, skills, or mindset that completely nullified their plan. They assumed, as most people do in these situations, that ordinary appearances reflected ordinary capabilities. What they didn't see was the discipline, the focus, the strategic thinking, and the situational awareness that lay beneath the surface. Underestimation is almost always a product of incomplete information, but it's also a product of arrogance, the belief that small stakes can control someone else's response. There's also a psychological element at play. When people believe they have the upper hand, they often act with greater boldness, ignoring warning signs that might otherwise give them pause. They laughed, they joked, they treated the situation as trivial because their assumptions reinforced their sense of superiority. This is the danger of underestimating someone. It emboldens the underestimator while simultaneously provoking the underestimated. The power dynamic shifts in subtle ways, often unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Confidence rooted in ignorance can be the most dangerous form of arrogance, and that was exactly what fueled their actions in this scenario. Every micro-decision, the words spoken, the smirk, the casual body language, was influenced by the belief that they were untouchable, that they were in control. They didn't pause to consider her reactions beyond the surface, nor did they anticipate that she might read more into the situation than they intended to convey. The underestimated person often sees far more than the overconfident, and the misalignment of perception creates tension. The gap between expectation and reality is fertile ground for surprises, for reversals, and for moments that leave a lasting impression. Underestimation sets the stage for those reversals because it blinds the underestimator to the true capabilities of the other person. Another aspect of underestimation is that it often leads to mistakes in judgment, timing, and strategy. They assumed she would follow a predictable path, that she would respond in a way that matched their expectations. In reality, the underestimated person has the advantage of unpredictability. When someone is not fully understood, when their skills and motivations are ignored, every action they take can disrupt the assumptions of others. The $5 bet may have seemed insignificant, but it acted as a catalyst, testing limits and exposing weaknesses in perception. Underestimation doesn't just affect decisions in the moment. It affects the trajectory of every subsequent action. It's also worth noting the social and emotional dimension. People who underestimate others often do so because they seek validation of their own confidence. They want to feel clever, superior, or in control. They fail to consider that the underestimated person may be quietly observing, analyzing, and planning a response. This imbalance creates tension that is invisible until it erupts, and it is fueled by the very arrogance that caused the misjudgment. The act of underestimating someone is not neutral. It carries with it the potential to provoke reactions that are proportionally larger than the initial action, creating a situation where the original instigators are no longer the ones steering the outcome. The Navy SEALs' response was nothing like anyone expected. It didn't come slowly, and it didn't come timidly. It came with the precision and decisiveness that only comes from someone trained to handle situations that most people couldn't even imagine. From the very first moment, it was clear that this was not an ordinary interaction. The casual air, the laughter, the small stakes of a $5 bet, all evaporated when the SEAL entered the equation. He didn't react in panic or anger. He reacted with control, with awareness, with the ability to assess, anticipate, and act in a fraction of a second. That ability is built over years of training, of conditioning the mind and body to respond under pressure, to measure risk and outcome with near-perfect accuracy. And in that moment, all of that training was visible, not through bluster, not through posturing, but through the quiet certainty of action that left no room for doubt. His approach was deliberate. Every movement, every glance, every pause carried intent. There was no hesitation, no wasted motion. The kind of situational awareness that defines elite operators like him allows them to process far more information than ordinary people can. They see patterns, anticipate reactions, and calculate consequences in real time. While others were still caught up in the humor of the situation, the SEAL was already assessing the environment, analyzing the dynamics, and preparing to ensure that the outcome would be controlled entirely by him. It's an almost invisible skill to outsiders because it manifests in efficiency, calm, and authority, not in spectacle. Yet that quiet mastery is what makes the response so devastatingly effective. People often assume that power lies in numbers, in aggression, or in loud, obvious displays of strength. But what the SEAL demonstrated is that true power lies in mastery over oneself and the environment. It is the ability to act decisively when others are reactive, to remain calm when others panic, and to project confidence without needing to announce it. That calm precision is intimidating in its subtlety, almost imperceptible until it has already taken effect. The individuals who thought a $5 bet was harmless suddenly found themselves facing someone whose skills and mindset they had no frame of reference for. Someone whose response was calibrated to ensure that the imbalance of power was corrected instantly and effectively. His actions were not chaotic or emotional. They were deliberate, measured, and exact. That is the hallmark of someone who has been trained for high-pressure environments where mistakes can be catastrophic. Every action had a purpose, every movement was intentional, and every decision was based on a clear understanding of consequences. This is what separates ordinary responses from extraordinary ones: the ability to transform a moment of potential chaos into a controlled demonstration of skill. The ordinary people involved had treated the situation as a joke, something trivial, but in reality, the SEAL's response converted it into a teaching moment about underestimated strength and unseen capability. There is also an element of psychological mastery in his response. Elite operators are trained not only in physical skill, but in influencing outcomes through presence, timing, and strategic action. They understand how to read people, how to anticipate panic, hesitation, or miscalculation, and how to turn those reactions into advantages. The ones who underestimated her and threw down $5 were caught completely off guard, not because of aggression, but because of control. They weren't confronted with loud threats or chaos. They were confronted with precise, calculated moves that left them with no choice but to experience the consequences of their misjudgment. Every second mattered. Every gesture carried significance. In a situation where ordinary people might stumble, hesitate, or react unpredictably, the SEAL's response was a model of efficiency. It's not just about strength or skill. It's about timing, about understanding exactly when and how to act so that the effect is maximized and the margin for error is minimized. The power of this response lies not in spectacle, but in its inevitability. It was clear, even to the untrained eye, that nothing they did could alter the outcome once the seal had decided on a course of action. That kind of certainty is disarming, and it transforms the dynamic entirely. This is also a moment that illustrates the difference between appearance and reality. The ordinary participants believed they were in control because the stakes seemed low, because their confidence masked their ignorance, because they were unaware of the depth of skill and experience they were dealing with. The seal's intervention shattered that illusion immediately. It was a lesson in the danger of assumptions, the importance of awareness, and the reality that sometimes the person least expected to act with authority is the one who dominates the situation completely. In these few moments, all the casual bravado, the jokes, and the small bets were rendered meaningless. Payback served with precision is something that people rarely see coming until it's already happening. It isn't messy or chaotic. It's deliberate, calculated, and executed in a way that leaves no room for misunderstanding. In this scenario, the people who thought a $5 stunt would be harmless quickly realized that they had misjudged the situation entirely. Payback is not about anger. It's about correction, about setting the balance straight when someone has overstepped or underestimated the consequences. And when it's served with precision, the effect is magnified, not only in immediate impact, but in lasting impression. Precision payback doesn't scream, it doesn't over-explain. It simply happens, leaving everyone involved to process exactly what occurred. The power of precise payback lies in timing. There's a moment when action has the greatest effect, when the lesson is unmistakable, and when the consequences are undeniable. Acting too early or too late dilutes the impact. Acting at the right moment ensures that the message is clear. In this case, the response was perfectly timed. Every movement, every decision, and every action was synchronized to create a maximum effect with minimum waste. That timing transforms payback from a reaction into a demonstration, a calculated sequence designed to convey a lesson as effectively as possible. It is not impulsive or emotional, it is strategy in motion. The concept of precision extends beyond physical action. It is also psychological. Effective payback reaches into the mind of those who misjudged the situation, making them realize exactly how wrong they were in underestimating someone. They expected compliance, amusement, or submission, and instead they were confronted with skill, control, and consequence. The realization hits harder because it is both immediate and unavoidable. Precision in payback leaves no space for excuses or justifications. The lesson is clear. Actions have consequences, and misjudging someone can be costly, regardless of how small the initial act might seem. Control is another key element. In ordinary circumstances, payback can be messy and uncontrolled, often escalating conflict without a clear resolution. But when executed with precision, it demonstrates authority without chaos. The person delivering the payback is always several steps ahead, managing the situation with awareness and discipline. The recipients, on the other hand, are left with no options to redirect the outcome. In this case, the individuals who thought a $5 bet was harmless were completely out of their depth. They had assumed they were operating in familiar territory, but the precision with which payback was executed revealed just how miscalculated their assumptions had been. There's also a physical aspect to precise payback. It's not about brute force or overreaction. It's about the efficient use of skill and leverage. Every gesture, every action, and every reaction is intentional, designed to achieve the desired effect without unnecessary expenditure of energy or risk. This efficiency makes it all the more striking because it contrasts sharply with the casual, careless behavior that preceded it. Those who underestimate someone are often unprepared for how methodical, calm, and controlled a response can be. Precision makes payback almost surgical. It cuts straight to the heart of the lesson that needed to be conveyed, leaving the rest as an undeniable ripple effect. Precision also relies on understanding the target. Effective payback is tailored to the situation and the people involved. It is not random or indiscriminate. It is deliberate, crafted to ensure that the message is received, internalized, and remembered. In this case, the individuals who underestimated her were confronted with consequences that matched the magnitude of their actions. The $5 bet may have seemed minor, but the response was scaled not only to correct the behavior, but to reinforce the lesson about judgment, perception, and respect. Every action reinforced the consequences of misjudgment, leaving no doubt about what had been underestimated. The beauty of Payback with Precision is that it doesn't require spectacle to be effective. It doesn't need an audience or dramatic display. Its effectiveness is measured not by noise or attention, but by clarity and impact. Those on the receiving end understand exactly what happened, why it happened, and what it means for any future miscalculations. That clarity is what transforms a moment of retribution into a moment of teaching. A scenario that could have been trivial becomes memorable because of the control, timing, and intentionality behind the actions. It's a lesson delivered without words, but understood completely, leaving a mark that is impossible to ignore. Lessons on respect and consequences are among the most powerful that any experience can deliver, and yet they are also the ones most often ignored until a situation forces them into focus. In this case, the lesson began with a simple act, the offer of $5 for a stunt that seemed harmless, even trivial. The people involved assumed that their joke would pass unnoticed, that the consequences would be minimal, and that respect was something that could be overlooked or negotiated for a small price. But respect is not something that can be bought, coerced, or assumed. It is earned, maintained, and sometimes enforced by circumstance. The act of underestimating someone who deserves it is often the first step toward realizing the true weight of consequences. Respect, in this context, is both a social and a strategic principle. On the surface, it involves acknowledging another person's capability, authority, or agency. On a deeper level, it involves recognizing that actions have results, and that misjudgment, dismissal, or mockery carries potential repercussions. The people who offered the $5 bet failed to recognize this principle. They treated the situation as a joke, ignoring the inherent dignity, skill, and awareness of the person they were dealing with. They assumed that their control over the situation was absolute, that they could provoke or manipulate without consequence, and that the response, if any, would be predictable and manageable. They were wrong. Consequences, unlike respect, are rarely negotiable. They exist as natural extensions of action, often emerging in ways that are disproportionate to the original act. Small provocations, minor errors in judgment, and casual dismissals can all lead to outcomes that are far more significant than the initial event. In this case, the $5 bet was the spark, a minor act intended for amusement, but it quickly became the catalyst for a much larger lesson. The individuals who misjudged the situation learned, in a way that cannot be ignored or forgotten, that actions, even seemingly insignificant ones, carry inherent risks. The consequences were precise, immediate, and unambiguous, leaving no room for doubt about the cost of miscalculation. The interplay between respect and consequence is particularly important because it highlights how easily one can be undermined when the other is ignored. Respect is a preventative measure. It can deter misjudgment, guide behavior, and establish boundaries. Consequences are corrective. They reinforce those boundaries when they are violated or overlooked. In this scenario, the absence of respect triggered a response that was both corrective and instructive. The Navy SEALs' actions were not born of personal vendetta or emotional reaction. They were born of situational awareness, experience, and a clear understanding of cause and effect. The lesson was embedded in the response itself, illustrating the inextricable link between disrespect and unavoidable consequence. Moreover, lessons on respect and consequences are rarely theoretical, they are experiential. They are internalized not through argument or warning, but through first-hand experience of results. The people who offered the $5 could hear warnings all day, read rules, or be told what might happen, but those lessons would have remained abstract. It was only through the direct experience of facing someone who would not tolerate misjudgment that the lesson became real. The immediacy and clarity of consequence transforms respect from a vague idea into a concrete reality. That transformation is critical because it ensures that the lesson is remembered, internalized, and carried forward into future decisions. The scenario also emphasizes the cost of underestimation in teaching these lessons. When someone is underestimated, the lesson they deliver is often more potent, more striking, and more unforgettable. The misjudged party, in this case, was not just reacting. They were enforcing boundaries, demonstrating capability, and correcting an imbalance created by the disrespect shown. The lesson extended beyond a single moment. It created a framework for understanding that actions, no matter how small, have repercussions, and that underestimating another person can lead to consequences that are both precise and unavoidable. Finally, this episode underscores the universality of these lessons. Respect and consequences are not unique to elite training or extreme circumstances. They exist in every interaction, every negotiation, and every human exchange. They manifest whenever assumptions are made, when boundaries are crossed, or when people fail to recognize the agency and capability of others. The scale may differ, from a $5 bet to life-altering decisions, but the principle remains the same. Every interaction carries the potential to teach or reinforce these lessons, and failure to acknowledge them can lead to outcomes that are immediate, unavoidable, and unforgettable. How a small stunt turned unforgettable begins with the idea that even the tiniest actions can carry enormous weight. What seemed like a trivial bet, a $5 joke tossed casually across a table, quickly became the starting point for a story that no one involved would ever forget. Often, people fail to recognize how minor gestures, small provocations, or seemingly insignificant choices can set off chains of events far beyond what was imagined. In this case, a tiny action that might have been laughed off in another context became the catalyst for a lesson on respect, skill, and consequence that left a lasting impression. The transformation from small stunt to unforgettable event lies in the ripple effect, the way one moment, amplified by reaction, perception, and capability, can reverberate in ways that cannot be controlled or ignored. The first element that makes a small stunt unforgettable is its unexpected outcome. People who engage in trivial provocations often assume they can predict the results, that their actions are harmless, and that any response will be manageable. They underestimate the power of the people involved, the skills at their disposal, and the situational awareness that governs their response. In this instance, the Navy SEALs' involvement completely flipped the expected outcome. What was supposed to be a minor, humorous act became a demonstration of precision, discipline, and authority. That contrast between expectation and reality is what makes the experience memorable. The more ordinary or casual the initial act, the more striking the response appears, and the deeper the impression it leaves on everyone involved. Another factor that turns a small stunt into something unforgettable is the element of skill or competence displayed in response. Ordinary people may respond with anger, frustration, or chaos when confronted with provocation, but exceptional individuals act with control, timing, and efficiency. Their reactions are deliberate, targeted, and proportionate, demonstrating that even minor provocations can have serious consequences when met with expertise. The Navy SEALs' response was the embodiment of this principle. Every action was measured, every decision intentional, and every consequence unavoidable. The people who started the stunt were not only surprised, they were forced to confront the reality of their misjudgment in real time. Perception also plays a critical role. A small stunt becomes unforgettable when it exposes assumptions and reveals truths that were previously hidden. The $5 bet was an experiment in perception, a test of boundaries, and a demonstration of confidence, or, perhaps more accurately, overconfidence. Those who believed they could control the situation failed to perceive the depth of skill, discipline, and situational awareness possessed by the person they were challenging. The response shattered those assumptions instantly. The moment became a lesson not just in capability, but in humility, respect, and the consequences of misjudgment. When perception is challenged in such a dramatic way, the memory of the event lingers far longer than it would have otherwise. Timing and escalation are also critical. Small stunts often become unforgettable when the response is perfectly timed, catching the instigators off guard. There is a window in which action has maximum impact, a moment where the lesson is delivered with clarity and precision. In this scenario, the timing of the Navy SEALs' intervention ensured that the individuals who started the stunt were fully aware of the consequences in the moment, leaving no ambiguity about cause and effect. Escalation was controlled, deliberate, and measured, ensuring that the outcome was both instructive and dramatic. This perfect alignment of action and timing elevates a simple prank into a story that is retold, analyzed, and remembered. Context amplifies the memorability of a small stunt. In an ordinary setting, small bets and challenges might be dismissed as harmless jokes, easily forgotten. But in this context, where assumptions, skill, and authority intersected, the impact was magnified. The ordinary and the extraordinary collided, turning a $5 bet into an experience that was remarkable and inescapable. The setting, the people involved, and the stakes, though initially perceived as minimal, became a stage for a demonstration that highlighted capability, control, and consequence in a way that could not be ignored. Finally, what makes a small stunt unforgettable is the human tendency to remember stories that defy expectation. People remember moments that challenge their assumptions, that combine humor with shock, or that reveal hidden truths about human ability and judgment. The $5 bet, seemingly insignificant at first, became a story because it contained all these elements. It was a tiny action with enormous consequences, a trivial gesture that turned into a vivid memory, a simple stunt that became a lesson in perception, skill, and respect, and a narrative that lingered far beyond the moment itself.